So, did the tectonic plates of global power just shift, like right under our feet? It turns out a few carefully chosen words from a key US ally, spoken in Beijing of all places, have sent some serious shockwaves through the world of diplomacy. Okay, let's get into it.
And there it is, the bombshell statement. You have Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau standing right next to Chinese President Xi Jinping, using that specific phrase, New World Order. Our source material for this explainer argues these words, well, they signal one of the biggest diplomatic shifts in modern history. So what in the world does this actually mean for the global balance of power? All right, to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to break down the source's analysis into 4 key parts. First, what this whole New World Order thing is really about. Then we'll look at why key allies might be, looking for new partners. Third, what economic tools they actually have to work with. And finally, how all this fits into a much, much bigger historical pattern. So let's kick things off with the event that really started this whole conversation. Canada's diplomatic mission to China, and that very, very specific choice of words. You've got to understand the context here is everything. This was the first time in 8 years that a Canadian Prime Minister had even visited China. So the source argues that by declaring a partnership to create new rules for a new world, Canada was basically sending a signal of a massive realignment. I mean, the source literally calls the move of America's northern neighbor into a rival's camp one of the biggest diplomatic failures in recent American history. That's a huge statement. So that leads to the really big question, right? Why? Why would a key U.S. ally make such a bold move? Well, the source material gives a pretty clear explanation for what's driving this change. And wow, this slide just lays it all out, doesn't it? On one side, you've got the U.S. putting tariffs on its own allies, and on the other side, you have this new Canada-China partnership that's all about removing tariffs, making new deals for electric cars, and lowering barriers for farmers. It's a totally different approach to business. And the source material goes even deeper. It points to this growing feeling among allies that U.S. policy under Donald Trump is being driven by personal and family business interests, not what's best for the country. It even brings up a New York Times editorial to argue that this is basically forcing America's friends to start looking for partners who are maybe a little more reliable and predictable. So after that big trip to China, the Prime Minister heads to the World Economic Forum in Davos and drops another powerful message using this really memorable analogy about a greengrocer. And you're probably thinking, what on earth does a greengrocer have to do with any of this? Well, it comes from this famous essay by the Czech writer Václav Havel. He talked about a greengrocer who puts a communist slogan in his window, not because he's a true believer, but because it's what you do. It's a ritual of obedience to keep the powerful system off your back. The Prime Minister's point, at least according to the source's interpretation, was that for decades, U.S. allies have been doing the same thing, just going along with American dominance. And his message was crystal clear. It's time to stop the formal acting. It's time to take down the signs. Okay, so if countries are getting ready to take their signs down, what happens next? What can they actually do to be more independent? Let's take a look at the new economic arsenal that's being talked about. Everybody, meet the trade bazooka. It's this powerful defensive tool that would let Europe basically team up and shut down its market to any country trying to use economic pressure to get its way. And the irony here, as the source points out, is just, wow. This weapon was originally designed with U.S. help to push back against China, but now European leaders are openly wondering if they might have to use it against the United States. And that brings us to the financial weapon that everyone talks about, the so-called nuclear option. You see, countries like China and Japan hold trillions of dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds. The question is, could they actually use them to bring the entire U.S. economy to its knees? Well, the theory sounds pretty simple, right? A huge sell-off crashes the dollar. But the reality, the source argues, is way more complicated. See, most of these bonds can't just be cashed in whenever you want. And more importantly, if you try to sell $1 trillion of anything all at once, you'd tank its value. The seller would end up losing a catastrophic amount of their own money. It's basically a weapon that blows up in your own face. So, and this is the crucial point. Instead of some big, sudden attack, the more realistic strategy, which countries like China are already doing, is to play the long game. The source lays out this slow, methodical shift. Step by step, move away from the dollar, swap out U.S. bonds for other things like gold, and just, over many years, slowly chip away at the power of the U.S. dollar as a tool of global influence. So for our last section, the source puts all of this into a much bigger historical context.
It argues that what we're seeing isn't just about one president or one trade deal, it's about a predictable pattern that we've seen over and over again in the life cycle of empires. The argument from the source is pretty straightforward. For any empire, the hunt for security never ends, and it always means expansion. From the very first Jamestown settlement pushing out native tribes, to taking huge chunks of land from Spain and Mexico, to occupying islands in the Pacific, all the way to today's reported interest in Greenland, the need for more land, more buffer zones, is just constant. Now, this ancient quote from a Greek historian over 2,000 years ago is apparently being brought up again by European leaders when they talk about U.S. actions. It's a really brutal summary of power politics. Basically, might makes right. The powerful do what they want, and the weak just have to deal with it. But here's where the source makes a really sharp critique. It points out what it sees as some serious hypocrisy. European leaders are using this quote now that they feel like the weak ones in the conversation about Greenland. But, the source argues, they had no problem acting like the strong ones in places like Gaza, Libya, and Yemen. The argument is that they only seem to mind the might is right rule when it's being applied to them. And all of this leads to the source's central idea about history, that it's just in the DNA of an empire to keep expanding for the sake of its own security. And that process only really stops when the empire itself collapses, which often drags the whole world down with it into a period of chaos and change. So, we're left with this final, really provocative thought to chew on. Are we watching the early stages of this historic cycle playing out right now? Are today's headlines about trade wars and shifting alliances just the latest chapter in a story that's as old as civilization itself? It's a pretty powerful question to think about.